All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Metal and Forge podcast. Episode number 13 we got here. This podcast is weekly, and it is about manhood, entrepreneurship, American life, and matters of the soul. I'm Kent Lapp. I'm here with Austin Lapp and Patrick Miller. Guys, how was your week? Anything you want to touch on before we get rocking on the show here?
It feels like New Year's Day.
New Year's Day?
Yeah, I mean the first Monday of the new year, and the last week was like holidays, and it's been a fog, and now today feels like the first day of the year.
Gotcha. Okay.
Am I the only one?
Huh?
No.
Well, New Year's Day to me doesn't feel like the first day of the year ever. It feels like kind of a holiday, you know, where you're sleeping in or whatever.
Yeah.
So
this feels like the first
feels
day
different.
of the year to me.
Well, the first day back to work, man, my phone and I was getting bombed today. I think everybody was like the last, was it Wednesday was New Year's Day? So we had Thursday and Friday. Dude, we may as well just take an entire 2 weeks off of everything in my industry anyway.
Yeah.
Especially when the holiday falls on like a Wednesday.
Yes.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like, it's
Agreed.
so rough. I mean, it's awesome.
It's
whatever,
chaos.
But
Yeah.
chaotic.
It is a mess.
So, guys, I got a YouTube comment I want to read for you guys here. By the way, I think we have over 18,000 views on our YouTube channel, so people have been dipping in on that, so people might want to check that out. But so check out this comment, and this is in no way to belittle anyone. You know, he's making a point. But here's the comment. The universe exists. No proof of God so far. And that's the comment. And I just thought that was really interesting and revealing both at the same time. And actually highly contradictory, you know, because in his viewpoint, the universe is autonomous from God. They're two separate things, and one might not relate or correlate to the other. But from a Christian worldview, that actually doesn't make sense. They would be very much united. You know, like if there is a God, then you would assume that the universe would be kind of in a way one with that God, and one would not be possible maybe without the other. Maybe God would be possible without the universe, but not the other way around. And actually, even the Bible, doesn't the Bible even say that? It's just fascinating, like that the universe speaks of God.
Mm-hmm.
I just thought that was fascinating.
That worldview that's laid out in that brief comment there, that worldview is shrinking as a percentage of people who hold it. There is a return to some idea of God and a return to a desire for, the religious and the mystical and the transcendent and the enchantment of the re-enchantment of everything. And so guys out there putting forth a strictly materialist atheist worldview, that's, that idea is over basically.
Yeah, I agree. And the best probably tactical, tangible proof of God would be the universe. You know, because how did it get here? You know, would be one question. So,
yeah. I mean, heck, even Richard Dawkins was on record as saying that he, of course, consents to the idea that he's a cultural Christian. You know, Richard Dawkins. You know, so it's like this idea of a strictly materialist worldview is completely cooked.
Yeah,
I like that verse where to rebuttal this with scripture. Not that I'm arguing with the guy, but I like the concept of even the rocks and trees crying out. Like we tend to think of them as non-living things that were just here for us, but they're actually sometime going to be alive and like cry out for their creator. It just blows my mind to think about that.
Yeah, it's actually part of the reason that I'm not it's one of the things that gives me comfort in the face of death, is knowing that my physical body will go into the physical earth, which is part of the universe. And that has to be integrated with God, otherwise it couldn't be. And there's this tangible, fungible, very real uniting at that point that happens with Earth and by extension the universe. That's why I had the new tattoo on my left shoulder that looks like a pine tree. That's what that signifies to me. All right, the 4 very brief news items. How about that? to cover quickly before we get into the docket. Breaking news, apparently Justin Trudeau is stepping down. That is
Congratulations,
literally
Canada.
Congratulations, Canada. We welcome you into the fold. And we're excited that you're finding a new way together forward. That's all I know about it. I just saw it was breaking news.
Have you guys watched anything on Pierre Poilievre? I think that's how I'm saying his name. He's the conservative leader. You watch any of his videos? He is.
Never heard the name.
Yeah, I've heard
I think
him.
I'm saying it right.
Yeah, I think so. He's had a couple conversations with Jordan Peterson that are pretty revealing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. What was his name again, Austin?
Pierre Poilievre. I think okay. It doesn't spell like that, but yeah, he's the leader of the Conservative Party. I don't understand their government up there.
Okay.
But if you start YouTubing him, the algorithms will take from there, and it's pretty interesting.
So, number 2, and my dog is outside barking. I'm going to see if I can get that handled. You could probably hear it. Sorry. Dana White is joining the board of directors at Meta, and this may not be as significant to you guys if you don't follow the UFC, but Dana White is the man at the UFC, and there wouldn't be the UFC as we know it without Dana White. And he just seems to me, I don't know him, but he seems like a very smart in the entrepreneurial sort of way, very much a hustler, has very strong on the vision front, but then also they're executing extremely well at the UFC also. He's just a very interesting dude, and he's experienced a lot of success with the UFC and otherwise. And, he's just a normal man's man, and he's now on the board of directors at Meta.
That's kind of a surprising pick to me.
Wow.
Very surprising to me.
Who picks that?
This is an outsider pick right here, and my assumption is that Zuck is wanting to take parts of Facebook or Meta in a direction, maybe not even in a new direction altogether, but maybe in some ways a new direction where he feels Dana White can add value. That's my assumption, and I suppose he probably will.
Yeah, it's been interesting to notice Zuck's shift since Trump's reelection, and even prior to that a little bit, as the winds started to shift a little bit, he started distancing himself from the kind of leftist madness to a certain extent, even though he was all in on that, and to be fair, he probably felt like he had a gun to his head, and he probably did have a gun to his head, to be fair, but he was not as courageous as Elon in, telling the government where to get off when it came to things like censorship and et cetera. I think in the future, he might be a stronger advocate for free speech and all that. I think he learned his lesson through the last, 4 or 5 years. And it'll be interesting to see how far to the right or how far in the direction of freedom, anti-establishment that he kind of shifts in this. It's an interesting development.
Agreed. And I don't know the specifics on this, but Dana launched Power Slap in the last couple of years. And, personally, I think it's a little bit of a silly sport, and it's sort of embarrassing, and I don't pay attention to it at all and don't care for it. But apparently Power Slap either broke some records with social media or did things. It hit a certain level of success that had not really been hit before at all, or certainly very often through social media. So I just wonder if that was part of Zuck seeing, man, this guy's really using social media with the things he's into, in particular UFC and also Power Slap, and let's bring him on board. So I think it's a great development. Next, did you guys
educate me on that? Is that where they hit each other in the face as hard as they can?
Yeah, just slap the shit out of each other.
That's it.
It's crazy.
You've just explained the sport. Two guys stand across a small circle podium from each other, and I don't even know how it works. I think you take turns slapping each other on the face, and whoever gets knocked out first. It's really, it's pretty ridiculous. But
serious?
Oh yeah, but he's printing money. Dana's
there's money in it.
Oh, he's making money with Power Slap. People are watching it. I don't understand why.
Okay.
Next, did you guys see Rick Perry, the former governor of Texas, on Joe Rogan's podcast, along with Brian Hubbard, discussing Ibogaine?
I haven't watched it. I saw that they had the conversation. But
So
I
I
knew
don't.
Perry was advocating for Ibogaine, but I haven't listened to that
Yeah,
conversation.
I just hadn't known it. I think the episode came out last week at some point, and Ibogaine is a plant. Apparently, I don't know anything about it, and it is proving benefits for PTSD. They're focused initially on veterans coming home with PTSD, high anxiety, depression, and addiction. And it's showing benefits, particularly with PTSD. That's the one they were talking about the most because they're targeting the veteran community because that's a little it's the best demographic to target for political change, and also it's the people that we owe the most to, and it's also unfortunately the people that are getting taken care of about the least well, which is pretty sad.
Yeah.
But Ibogaine is a plant medicine that's not legal in America, but you can go to Mexico for these treatments, and it is um, proving success in a way that's unprecedented and almost unbelievable. And it's overwhelmingly positive in the results coming from this. And, but, you could place it in the category, probably in the same big box category as ayahuasca and some of these other psychedelics. What's the mushroom one?
Psilocybin.
Yeah. I'm assuming it probably falls roughly in that category, and that has been a pretty tricky category in the last few decades. And to see a conservative Christian Republican governor coming out in strong advocate for Ibogaine is, I think, really great. And I think it'll dovetail a little bit into one of our topics to discuss a little bit later on in the podcast. But I was just encouraged and very pleased to see someone who you would expect would be the first person against something like this is the person taking the lead on something like this. And they talk through how Kentucky had the opportunity to be the state that led the progress on these Ibogaine treatments. And then Governor Andy Beshear came in, and along with his attorney general, they said no, and Kentucky lost that opportunity, and it's highly unfortunate. And now Texas has the opportunity to lead the nation in terms of Ibogaine treatment. But it's a very, very fascinating episode. It's not a super long one. It's shorter than some. And I mean, you hear, Brian Hubbard's story. He, and you hear Rick Perry. So Rick Perry had his in with this was he somehow got connected with, I believe it was Marcus Luttrell, who's from the movie Lone Survivor, because he was taking a tour somewhere randomly and either bumped into Marcus Luttrell or got connected to Marcus Luttrell through that. And, he's just, what? I think he says that Marcus Luttrell lived with him for a year or two, unless it was another veteran. But definitely Marcus Luttrell or another veteran lived with Rick Perry for a year or two. And so they kind of took whoever it was under their wing and saw firsthand the benefits. I mean, life-changing is a strong statement, but apparently these Ibogaine treatments are actually life-changing. And there was, you'll see some stuff like this. One guy's wife had anti-psychotic medication, and it was really, really bad. And she had to come off of this antipsychotic medication, anti-bipolar medication for like 4 or 5 days before Ibogaine. And she was in such a bad shape without this medication. The husband's like, man, I don't know how we can make it 4 days without this medication. They went down there, got a medication, got the Ibogaine treatment, hasn't touched it since. And you just hear stories. I heard about Ibogaine a little bit from Sean Ryan's podcast also, because he's in the military community. And apparently the benefits of it are just simply overwhelming, and it's actually working. And it's not just a little bit working. It's like working ridiculously well. So hopefully we can get those treatments. It's not something you want to do on your own because it can mess with your heart a little bit if you don't tamper with the cocktail, which they do at the clinics, and everything seems to be fine. But you don't want to just run off and do it yourself because of that. But I was optimistic about, and also just intrigued and happy to see a Christian, conservative, Republican taking the lead on something like this.
Yeah. I think eventually the data is going to be strong enough that it'll just be pretty widespread. The use of certain psychedelics to treat things like addiction and depression and anxiety and PTSD and all of that. I mean, it's such a powerful treatment for these things that nothing else really compares. Nothing else is in the same zip code. So it'll be interesting to see how quickly that happens. But I mean, it does raise some questions, but it reduces suffering at a level that I don't, it would be hard to set up a really great opposition argument to allowing veterans to use Ibogaine to treat their PTSD. I mean, we're asking them to go over there to the armpit of the world and, kill brown people and, for no real morally defensible reason, and asking them to do things that scar them forever. It's like the least we can do is give them, some plant medicine to heal them when they get back.
Exactly right. And that was another interesting thing was Rick was mentioning that his comment was he's not aware in the history of mankind that there has been such a long war that basically has not ended like basically just a non-ending war for such a long time, because he was saying even in like the Civil War, you would fight for a day or two and then you would walk for 2 weeks, and then you would fight for a day or three and then you would walk for a week. And what we're doing, have been doing in Afghanistan and the Middle East since, basically call it 2000, we're 25 years in on this thing. And his point was, this is unprecedented. This is not how humans have historically done battle ever. That was just interesting for me to hear, because with my age, and this is kind of sad, but I'm just thinking this is how the world is. This is how it always has been, right?
You barely remember a time before we were at war with the
right.
in the Middle East.
That's right.
Yeah.
But the last comment to say on that was, to me, seeing Rick Perry talk about this is a reflection of the new conservatism. And it's sort of, that like it's all like it's an indication of like the new Republican Party, because certainly, you look back in the 60s and 70s and the Republicans would have been the one that was just, the answer is no. Now what was the question? And very much against, wouldn't even consider. And that seems like it might be changing. Another one of the things that might be changing politically.
Yeah.
Okay. The last little mini news item here. Are you guys read up at all on the Cybertruck that blew up in front of the Trump Tower in Vegas?
Oh, geez. Not a whole lot. I mean, that's a crazy story. There's enough for like 5 books in that whole thing.
It is, I think, a real wormhole. And I'll tell you what I know about this situation. And Sean Ryan has wound up being smack in the middle of it. And Patrick, I don't know if you know this, but Sean Ryan lives here in Middle Tennessee, in Franklin. His studio's there somewhere. My understanding.
I don't think I knew that.
So okay, New Year's Day, right? So some truck plows into 10 people in, was it New Orleans, right? And kills,
Yep.
and you would think that was a terrorist attack. There was a flag of some kind on the pickup truck, and the local FBI agent is saying it's not a terrorist attack, and the mayor is saying it is a terrorist attack. And you put a flag of any foreign nationality on a pickup truck and drive it into a crowd of people and 10 people die, should be viewed as a terrorist attack. And I think also on the same day, on New Year's Day, this Cybertruck blew up outside of Trump Tower in Vegas. That was all I knew. And I didn't even look into it, because I'll be honest with you guys, since the election, I have not been paying attention. I've not been on X very much. I've not been paying attention. It's kind of a nice break. And my philosophy is the adults are back in charge. I don't need to stay on top of every little single thing anymore. And that's genuinely how I feel about it. So I'm kind of enjoying the break for the most part. I mean, unless it's something really big, I'm probably not picking up on it right now. So that's what happened with Cybertruck. So just a few days ago, I heard a little bit more based on a text I got from someone. And look, I tried to get 2 people on tonight to talk about this for 10 or 15 minutes because I don't know anything about this. I'll tell you what I do know, but there is a real wormhole here. So here's what I know. This guy, I think his name was Matt. was in the military, and he was involved with something in 2019 where he witnessed some war crimes. I think it was Afghanistan, but now I'm not too sure. I'm pretty sure it was Afghanistan. He was being tracked by the FBI and others, government agencies, and he sent an email. You could think of it almost like a manifesto, but he sent an email. He was desperately trying to get in touch with Sean Ryan, and he wanted, I think, to go either on his podcast or give information to Sean Ryan to put out on his podcast, because Sean Ryan podcast is huge. It's blown up, and he's coming from a military standpoint. Sean Ryan is a former Navy SEAL. His producer was in the military also. He's very well connected in the military. This email from the guy who potentially blew himself up in a Cybertruck, if he was even in there, who knows, but I assume he was. This Mac guy who witnessed these war crimes sent an email / manifesto to someone else who he was trying to use to get on Sean Ryan's show. And in that email, he talks about the war crimes in 2019. He talks about the drones in New Jersey. And one of the things he says is U.S. and China has gravitational propulsion systems. And that, I think primarily those two things were the things that his knowledge on the gravitational propulsion systems, but I think mainly the war crimes, was basically having the government close in on him. And he felt he was trying to get to Mexico, and he wasn't sure he was going to make it before the government got him, basically. And he said in that email that he has a VBID, which is a vehicle-borne IED, a big VBID. And, you know, that's the extent of everything I know about this situation. I know there's a lot more to it, but, you know, he apparently, or someone, triggered that VBID in front of Trump Tower on New Year's. But it's created a lot of talk around what this guy knew, what was going on. And it's interesting to see this processing in real time, because one of the things that stood out to me was this guy wasn't trying to get on CNN. He wasn't trying to get on ABC News. He was trying to get on Sean Ryan's podcast. He was trying to get on a podcast to get the word out about something that he felt was important and urgent. Patrick, do you have any other details to fill in?
Reach out to Metal and Forge.
Well, I'm sure he didn't know about Metal and Forge.
How cool would that have been, breaking that story? No, other than, you know, there's some interesting things that, obviously, the idea that you put a Cybertruck, which is known to be bulletproof, you know, so it's not going to be a great way to deliver an IED if that's this, you know, what you're trying to do. If you're really trying to hurt people, you wouldn't put it in a Cybertruck. You'd put it in something that blows up more easily. So that's weird. The fact that the Cybertruck has self-driving capabilities, and it's totally plausible that whoever was driving it, whoever was behind the wheel, was dead with a gunshot wound to the head long before he ever got to Trump Tower. That's totally plausible. And it's certainly plausible that, you know, somebody could have executed the driver and closed the door and locked it and taken remote control of the vehicle and driven it, you know, 100 miles to, you know, in front of Trump Tower and then detonated this IED. So that's completely plausible. The messaging of having Trump Tower and then, you know, a Musk associated Cybertruck, you know, that imagery, like, you have to ask yourself, why does that happen? What's the message they're trying to send there? Yeah, I mean, there's just so many wild conspiracies that one could draw from this. And the crazy thing is that none of them are probably as strange as the truth, which is just, that's the era we live in now. But yeah, I think I would have to say it's completely plausible and very likely that, you know, the U.S. government had a hand in offing this guy and trying to send a message to other potential whistleblowers by parking, you know, the Cybertruck in front of Trump Tower and kind of blowing it up with this soft little IED. But yeah, that's
Correct.
It's
And
crazy times we live in.
yep, and no one else was killed. And I agree. The one thing I thought of is maybe in front of Trump Tower, Cybertruck, if he did pull the trigger himself or explode that thing himself, and he did kind of commit to his own death in this act, if the purpose there was to get his story out, and he felt like either way he's probably going to die, but this way he can do it on his own terms and get the story out, he did a really good job at that, because the story did get out, and that's a really good way to get attention. If you're going to die anyway, no one else died. But I'm not saying that's what happened, because I could just as easily see any of the scenarios that you discussed. But the one thing I did, there is absolutely a smoking gun here. And one of the little anecdotes is, I believe it was Sean Ryan, it was Sean Ryan's producer, was on the phone with someone from the military that wanted to talk with him. And he said to the producer, this military guy said, and between you and us, between you and me, this guy had a son that doesn't match his DNA. And Sean is like, okay, first of all, you're on the phone with the producer of a media guy, and you say between you and me, and you're still on the record. That means you're just doing this dumb little passive aggressive sneaky opposite thing where you actually want me to tell people this is a story you want to get out. I think maybe that was a storyline or a headline of some sort in the days after the explosion, although I didn't see it, was, hey, this guy had a son who didn't match his DNA, and maybe that's what caused him to blow himself up. And, when I hear that, I just think that's so U.S. government. That has 3-letter agencies written all over it. I mean, this is what they do, and they're very, very good at it.
Totally. 100%.
Misdirection and all this. All right.
Yeah, well, I did, as soon as Trump was elected, I knew that it was going to get very interesting between Election Day and Inauguration Day, because there, the establishment doesn't want to be, to have to deal with Trump, with the Trump administration. And they're not going to go quietly into the night. They're not going to let Doge just come in and, slash their budgets and cut them out and get rid of them. It's not going to be that easy. They've been in power a long, long time. They've seen a lot of presidents come and go. And, remains to be seen whether Trump's going to be successful in getting rid of them. But I think he has as good a chance as any. And he certainly knows more about how the system works now than he did last time around. But goodness, they are parasitic, evil swamp creatures that, and they doing what they do.
Too many of them are. Too many of them are. You're exactly right. I thought the gravitational propulsion system thing was very interesting to me, because if China and America does have gravitational propulsion system technology of any kind, that answers a lot of questions in my mind about the UFO thing. That explains a lot of the flying phenomenon that we otherwise wouldn't be able to explain. I don't know that completely rules out the fact that there is extraterrestrial vehicles or living, because the one scenario is possible is we found some of their craft, and hey, we're pretty good at innovating, and now we have
engineered it.
Yeah, reverse engineered it. So, I just thought it was fascinating. All right, let's get into the docket. First up, let's talk about Proverbs 9, 1-6. And I think the best way to jump into this is just for me to read it. So let's read Proverbs 9, 1-6, and we want to talk about this a little bit. Hey, I think this is the first time we're reading a few verses out of the Bible and discussing it. So we'll see if it's fun or not. But hey, we could do this more, because there's some, an unlimited amount of stuff we could talk about just straight from the Bible. But all right, Proverbs 9, 1-6. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her beasts. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table. She has sent out her young women to call from the highest places in the town. Whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread, and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways, and live, and walk in the way of insight. And one of the things that I want to come back to discuss on this is verse 6, where it says, leave your simple ways. my Bible, the ESV, has a little note, and it says another way you can interpret that is, or leave the company of the simple. So this verse could read, leave the company of the simple and live and walk in the way of insight. Let's come back to that. But the first thing that stood out to me when I was reading this was, hey, wait a minute. Every time I thought I read something like this in Proverbs, it was talking about adultery, fornication, prostitution, a young simple man getting, drawn in where he should not. And I guess every time I had read over this in the past, or if it stood out to me, I totally forgot about it. I guess it just didn't stand out to me how, hey, wait a second here. Wisdom is actually doing some of the same things that you read about 2 chapters prior in chapter 7, where it's warning against adulteresses. And actually, it's sort of some of the same things that's playing out here. But in this case, it's wisdom that is making the call. It's from the good side and not the bad side. It's from the light and not the darkness. But there's a young woman out there asking, seducing is probably not quite the right term, but there's a young woman out there trying to entice a simple man to come in here to wisdom. One of the things that I wanted to point out with this is, I think one of the things this is saying is good, the light, the side of the good and the light, or the right way, or the side of truth, is not boring. It doesn't have to be boring. Matter of fact, if it is boring, maybe something is not quite right. It doesn't have to be dull. It doesn't have to be boorish. It doesn't have to be plain. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be non-energetic. And for some reason, and it would be fascinating to know exactly why this is, but I do think that is in direct contradiction to our baseline of thought generally. And I don't know if this is how it's always been. I don't know if it's in the last 100 years. I don't know if this is just a reflection of me and my environment. But the way of God is not dull. And if it is, something might be a little off. So that was the first thing that I wanted to touch on, because it's basically saying, like, wisdom is out there with a young woman on the streets saying to the simple, hey, the party's in here, come in here. And that's sort of how it's portrayed. Now, the other thing I want to just touch on is, if you go like 2 chapters prior in chapter 7, and this was the terminology of Proverbs that I guess I was just most used to. When there's a house, someone's making preparations, there's a simple man on the street, there's a woman calling out to him. I was just thinking in Proverbs, now we're talking about the adulteress. And it does, chapter 7 does talk about that, but you see a lot of the same things in chapter 9, and it's not talking about the adulteress at all. But the commonalities between the first number of verses in chapter 7 and the first number of verses in chapter 9 is, in both cases, there's a simple person on the street. In both cases, that simple person is portrayed as a man. In both cases, there is a young woman calling, there is someone else calling out to that simple man on the street. And in both cases, that person calling out to the simple man on the street is portrayed as a woman. What's interesting is, in the case of the adulteress, and also in both cases, the women are calling the simple man to come into her house, into the dwelling. And so that's what's common across both scenarios. another thing that's common across both scenarios is there is preparations that have been made. In the case of the adulteress, you can read in chapter 7, her preparations have to do with the couch, the bed, the lint, like that type of a thing. But in chapter 9, wisdom's preparation has to do with a table, eating, wine, sustenance. I thought that was an interesting little difference between the two stories there. But the thing that so the commonalities, and then also seeing where the difference is. But the one thing that stood out to me just a little bit is, well, okay, in one case it's bad, and in the other case it's good. In the good case, you're a simple person, so you want to come in here to the house of wisdom and not be simple anymore. In the other case, you're a simple person and you're getting taken advantage of, essentially, and that's going to be bad for you, and it's going to cause more rot in your life and so forth. And so if you're a simple man on the street and there is a young, beautiful woman calling to you on that street, beckoning you to come back to her house or dwelling or structure, you're going to need discernment pretty early on in this process, because if you're a simple person, you don't want to walk past the invitation from wisdom, because if you do, you'll just continue to be a simple person. But if you don't have discernment and you misread the situation and then you get called into the adulteress, well, that's very bad. That's going to make your life even worse. So just the fact that it's going to take some discernment out on the street, seemed like an insight that we could get from this.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's challenging about the nature of the kingdom of heaven and the nature of the kingdom is that there's very few bright lines that just are, clear and clearly painted on the highway, let's say, to define what is the narrow way and what is not. Like, there's a few principles that are rock solid, love being the preeminent one, is the defining, kind of energy and motivation and presence of the kingdom. But this was brought up to me over the holidays. My son, who's at Vanderbilt, he's in a fraternity, and he was asking me about, knowing what I know now, what would my position be on substance use as a young man, knowing what I now know now as a 48-year-old. But and he wanted to kind of go down the list of, by substance: alcohol, nicotine, cannabis, psychedelics. We just talked about all of them. And obviously, being in a fraternity setting at an elite university, he would have access to use any substances that he wanted to, and there's nobody there to tell him he can't. So it's up to his own judgment and conviction to how to engage with that stuff. And in a sense, it's because I find myself in a season of, even though I've experimented with a lot of different things, I find myself being drawn to the simplicity of, like, I want what's most real. And so I'm diving into really raw dogging life, and just not having anything, no nicotine, no alcohol, no cannabis, no nothing. It's just plain and simple: water, coffee, food, good food. And so, but as we got into that conversation, as a dad, of course, I wanted to kind of put the finger on the scales of, stay away from that stuff. It's dangerous, right? But I was honest, then the reason he could ask me is he knew I was going to tell him what I really thought. And when it came down to it, I couldn't, in good conscience, tell him that, no, you shouldn't ever try any of that stuff. It's like, you should never drink, in college. You should never smoke a cigarette in college. You should never smoke a joint in college. I couldn't say that. It's like, as a dad, it would have been more comfortable to say that, but I couldn't, in good conscience, define the nature of following Christ. And this was all nested inside of the pursuit of following Christ and building the proper kinds of relationships that would orient you properly in the world and all of that. So it was interesting to notice that the kingdom of heaven, in the pursuit of the kingdom, it doesn't always make super clear where those lines are. And in this example that you're bringing up, Kent, you have, you know, both contexts are invitations to meet, what you might consider a fairly base physical desire or need, good food and drink or sex. And you already mentioned all the other ways in which those two scenarios are similar. And so it is very interesting to notice that, there is it's a very fine line between these two, even though one leads to destruction, the other one leads to life. I'm glad you brought this up. It's a fascinating, I guess the other thing I want to throw out there as a kind of framework or way to think about it that came up when I was talking to my son about this whole debate is in Revelation, where it talks about that God would rather have us be hot or cold rather than lukewarm. He will spit us out of his mouth if we're lukewarm. And the point being, and this runs counter to the kind of hyper puritanical focus of much of the last, several decades of Christian thought. But it's like, it's actually better to take risks and fail, take risks and sin than it is to just not take action at all and not become, not develop, not pursue, like being lukewarm and just sitting on your thumbs for fear of maybe, well, I don't want to sin. I don't want to do the wrong thing. And so I'm just going to sit on my hands. It's like God would rather we take a risk and maybe be wrong than just sit on our hands out of fear that we might get it wrong. And so I would say to the young man who's trying to decipher if that's a house of wisdom or if it's a house of ill repute, well, at least you're out there on the street and having that experience, and you're not just sitting at home, on your hands.
That's a good point. Austin, do you have any reflections back to Patrick on that, or any thoughts that you had in mind on this section of verses here?
Yeah, particularly wisdom. There's a couple of things. I feel like Proverbs is always telling us to pursue wisdom. So there's like this back and forth relationship where, and I see it in other passages where wisdom is out and crying in the streets. I think there was a couple chapters earlier where it's wisdom is looking for the simple. But then there's also responsibility on our part to pursue wisdom. So I guess if I were to split the difference between the two scenarios you're talking about, one is looking for wisdom, and the other one, like if you're going back to Proverbs 7 where it's talking about the adulteress, like there's instruction in there. No, cross the other side of the street. Like don't be dumb. Like don't put yourself in sin's way. That's your defense. I feel like offense is also pursuing wisdom. And I think of Solomon quite a bit, the wisest man and the wealthiest man to have ever lived. I think I looked up once upon a time like what his net worth would be like today. It's like $3 trillion.
Really?
Yeah, it's
interesting.
Massive. Yeah.
Wow.
Do some Googling on it. I mean, it's a rabbit hole. But that's how wealthy he was. And it came down to, like, if you remember, the Lord was like, came to him in a dream, whatever, and said, hey, you're going to be king. What you want? He's like, I just want wisdom. Like, I don't care about anything else other than just give me wisdom. And God was so honored by his request that obviously he gave it to him. But then he said, as a result of that, you're going to get all the other stuff that all the other kings ever wanted and then some. And so I think it's really fascinating how I love wisdom. I mean, I'm addicted to it in this odd way of, I don't know, I'm just fascinated by it because it is very elusive. You have to look for it. Like you can't you can't. It doesn't just. There's times where it shouts. There's times where it pursues, but I feel like it's like in all you're getting, get understanding and get wisdom. Like you just hear Solomon wrote Proverbs. I mean, a lot of it. And so I think of him a lot in this scenario. And I just like to focus on the beginning of his life. The end of his life was sad, but it's interesting reading. What's the other book he wrote? Lamentations.
Song of Solomon.
No, the other one. Lamentations is
Lamentation.
that's kind of a depressing book. Like that's
Yeah.
him. That's him writing after he's literally.
Ecclesiastes.
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's Ecclesiastes.
There's nothing
Yeah.
new under the sun. all
Nothing
that.
new under the sun. I
Yeah.
mean, the man had like what 900 different women he could have sex with, and yet it wasn't enough.
Mhm.
Like he talks about it, like I tried to fill my flesh. I mean, trillionaire a couple times over, literally could have anything, any woman he wanted, and it was never enough. And so I don't know. He fascinates me more than I don't know any other character in the Bible other than Jesus. But I love this whole topic of wisdom because, to be honest, I don't understand it. I
Yeah.
just know that like there's times where it shouts at you in the face, but there's other times where I'm like, hold on, stop. I mean, honestly, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is in James. And the book of James is actually, I think it's the oldest in the New Testament. I looked it up one time. So what would be the first thing that God would say to us in the New Testament? What would be the first thing that God would say to us in the New Testament? And right there in the beginning it says you're going to face hard things. It just is what it is. But you can ask God to give you wisdom and he will give it liberally without he doesn't dole it out. But we have to ask for it. So I love that whole thing of wisdom because every time my back's up against the wall, I'm like, hey, I'm going to ask for wisdom. He said I could, so I'm going to.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the one thing he
like
says,
that.
if you ask for it, he will give it to you, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, but Patrick, a question for you. So this was another thing that kind of just jumped off the page at me is it's fascinating to me also at how this story cuts against sort of the prevailing narrative that seduction, beauty, even youth are somehow sort of, we wouldn't say they're dirty, but we devalue them as much as we possibly can without being assholes, and then we still devalue them a little bit more than that. And now this is probably very much a product of our environment, but it's not just our environment, because I do think, I think you could look at some of the other world religions, and you could probably find some of this pretty quick in those also. But, this is, wisdom is sending out a young, presumably beautiful woman onto the street to bring people in who are simple to get wisdom. We know wisdom is from God. So if God is displaying the young, the beautiful, the enticing, and there is some amount of seduction in the right way with that, not in the wrong way, but this is being put forward as something that is just fine, possibly even to be celebrated and not to be mitigated, not to be hidden, not to feel ashamed of. What do you make of that? Because I ask, because if youth, beauty, are from the Lord, and we do, and it's actually part of the design baked into how our lives work best. And if we misunderstand that and think that if someone is beautiful or too beautiful, it's just too much, and they should do what they can to knock themselves down a little bit. If that's our worldview, but actually that's a worldview maybe hypothetically that would come from man, and it's not of God, then that is going to be at some detriment somewhere in our lives, in our communities, in our worldview, in our relationships. Something is going to suffer. Something suffers every time we step out of the designs from God.
Mm-hmm.
And if God has designed beauty and the adorning of that beauty, we know that Job paid, we don't know how much, I don't think, but we know for a fact that Job paid for the maintenance of his girls. And I love that little quip. Says nothing about it being wrong, says nothing about it not being a good use of his money. Job was paying for the maintenance of his girls. Now, you don't pay for maintenance of girls if it's not increasing their beauty, increasing their aesthetic, increasing their self-esteem, increasing their confidence. And so it seems to me, and even when we pair this with the New Testament and the Old Testament, it seems to me like there was a lot of beautiful, powerful women. And never does it seem to me that the Bible is seeking to tamp that down.
Right.
If anything, it seems like the Bible is, like if we walk back and step through the Bible and we experience these women, I think sometimes we would be like almost a little bit caught off guard, like, oh, is this okay? Like this is how it's supposed to be. But it seems to me like we've taken a bit of a turn from that. And I think this is...
That's putting it mildly.
Okay, so just to wrap this up, maybe in some cultures, in some segments of Christianity, we've taken a turn from that, and we have thought that beauty is too powerful. And the temptation factor with beauty, the greater the beauty, the higher the temptation factor. And so we don't want temptation because temptation can lead to sin. So wherever we can find areas of sin, we want to look for the temptation just in front of that, and we want to try to quell that temptation. So if beauty is creating a temptation, and temptation sometimes leads to sin, we want to make sure we quell that beauty, and we want to make that beauty less beautiful. That way it attracts less attention. That way it's less of a temptation. That way there's no sin. And I just wonder if we've really, really messed that up.
Yeah, that's a great point, a great observation. And if you look at the cultures and the timelines in which beauty has been suppressed over time, and I want to widen the aperture, not just focusing on feminine beauty, but beauty at large. Well, first of all, beauty, you can't separate beauty from God as a source. You can't, like, by definition, that's a non-starter. You can't separate. If you think of God and you give God the traditional attributes that we give him, then, truth, goodness, beauty, like it's from God. There's no separating that. And so to try to paint beauty as, something to denigrate it is to denigrate the image of God. It's to, it's going down the wrong way, down the wrong path. But you pointed out why you might be tempted to do that. And maybe in a wider scale, beauty, Jordan Peterson talks about the way in which beauty is a judge, in that it's the ideal that's in front of you and it beckons to you. Beauty lifts your, when you walk into a cathedral, your eyes are lifted to the heavens and you are put in a state of awe and reverence. And you're like, whoa, there's something going on here that's way beyond me. And, it's a judge. It's something, it's like, that's a lot more than I am capable of even understanding. And of course, there's an element of humanity, a dark side of humanity that wants to, well, the spirit of Cain, when Cain looked at Abel, he saw in Abel a judge, an ideal, an older brother who had sacrificed properly, life was going well for him, and he could not bear to gaze at that ideal. The beauty of Abel's life proved to be too much for Cain to bear, and Cain knew that he could have that same thing if he would sacrifice properly too, but he knew he was unwilling to do so. And so that resentment against that beauty that he saw in the ideal is what caused him to destroy that, to tear it down. And that is the human temptation is when we don't like to be judged by the beauty, the ideal, we seek to tear it down. We seek to put it in the dirt and stomp all over it, to profane it, to denigrate it, to lift up a cheap substitute. And you see that in the human story over and over again, is whenever there was true beauty, it was always at risk of the spirit of Cain being animated and tearing it down and putting it in the dirt. So there's that human flaw, human failure, the shadow side of our humanity. There's that risk. And I think, certainly when you look at modern Christianity, of course, you kind of have turbocharged some of the shadow side here with the purity culture. You've activated our shame mechanism by using purity language, and you've lifted up the beautiful woman, the beautiful aspect of God as it reflected in the feminine. You've lifted that up as the boogeyman that is going to drag you to hell. And so you have to, it's the same, in essence, it's the same impulse that drives radical Islamic groups to cause their women to cover up completely with the whatever you call the veils that they wear. There's that same impulse to hide that beauty, to keep it down, to keep from being confronted by that. And there's all kinds of downstream costs to that, not least of which is when you remove beauty, well, then what you're left with is uglier than it was. And it's like, it's something less human. It's also something less godly. And it's less aesthetically pleasing, and it also removes the kind of refining aspect of having the judge of the ideal out there calling people higher. So, scientific experiments have shown that when you put a woman, any woman, into a group of men, that those men, their behavior improves. They become more civilized just by having a woman in their midst. It kind of tamps down some of the more base elements of masculinity, and it beckons to, it calls forward some of the better parts of us. And so to the extent that you have a beautiful one, and if you've been in the presence of an embodied female aspect of God's creation, who is living in her femininity and is living in her beauty in a free and awake and embodied way, it's like it changes you. It changes the way that you perceive the world. It changes the way that you see, and it makes you feel self-conscious. And nobody likes to feel self-conscious. So there is a temptation to veil that, to make so that you can't see that, because then you don't have to feel self-conscious. But when you feel self-conscious, you have a choice to make about whether you're going to sacrifice the version of you that is feeling self-conscious and surrender to the fires of transformation that would bring about something more true in you and something more worthy in you, something more noble in you, to bring it out. And the same is true when you go into a museum and you look at art and you stare at that art. It's like it speaks to, it beckons to the highest thing in you, and it calls something forward. And it's like, well, you could just like not have any art at all and never see any art, and then you'd never have to feel the twinge of self-consciousness of, well, I wonder what I could bring forward into the world that would be beautiful. It's like, no, I have many faults, but one of the gifts that I have is that I've always been drawn to beauty. Now it was also there was a shadow side to that, but today I'm surrounded by art here in my office. I'm married to a beautiful woman. I have beautiful daughters. I am surrounded by beauty on all fronts. I am making my home as beautiful as I can manage on my current socioeconomic situation. I want to be surrounded by beauty because it beckons to me, and it calls forth the best in me. And I know that like, I'm conscious of the way in which it's uncomfortable. I'm conscious of the way in which it burns away the dross of my psyche and seeks to reveal something more true and more good in there. And it's like, that's a painful process, but I want that. I want the goodness of God more than I want to be comfortable. I'm willing to be uncomfortable in that way. And so I welcome beauty, and I celebrate beauty, and all the way down to personal aesthetics, and the way that you decide to decorate your house, and the way that the bag that you choose to carry, and the stores that you choose to shop in, and the Crocs or Hey Dudes that you put on your feet, or like whatever ugly footwear is most popular these days. It's like, no, I think it actually matters the way that you present yourself. I think that it doesn't matter maybe in an ultimate sense, in the kind of eternal destiny kind of sense, but it certainly matters. It's part of when you lose beauty, when you lose your connection to beauty, when you never see beauty, you can't see God either. And so just be careful what you wish for in all your tamping down of beauty, if that's the way you're oriented. And of course you're going to be afraid of beauty. That's the freaking point. So notice that.
Yeah, you laid that out exceptionally well. And to me, it seems like there is a cost because there's a balance to everything. And if you take, because this is what we're talking about, if you take a woman who is maybe beautiful at this level and you force her to be less beautiful because of the expectations of man, because of the unspoken parameters of the subculture that you happen to be living in, maybe it's because of her husband, and you force her to become less beautiful, you have just created an imbalance, and there is now a delta of something. You have taken essentially from that energy doesn't just disappear. You have made
Right.
something less beautiful. What is the cost? And that cost is primarily, in my opinion, it's primarily borne by that individual. And then it is also then born in a more implicit or second tier or third tier effect by those around her.
100%.
But it's primarily borne by her, and that is highly unfortunate, and it is unfair, and you might even go so far as to use the term abuse, because you have created a scenario where someone is going through a life in a way that is less flourished than they otherwise could. And someone someday is going to have to pay a price for that, because what you don't get to get away with in this life is by making someone who is weaker than you, by making their life less good.
Yeah, that's right.
And you do
That's
not
right.
want to be that person, because in particular, someone who is weaker than you, because that is a price that you're going to have to pay someday. And the final point that I wanted to make on that is, I guess, just that there is a real price, and sometimes you can see it in their eyes. You can see that something is not right. There is some parts of the eyes that are dead that should be alive, and maybe they were alive at one point and they've been dead for a long, long time, or maybe they've been dead for so long they can't even remember. But you can tell a lot by the look in someone's eyes, and I see that as highly unfortunate, and I see that as very sad. And I don't see it as it's a 6 one way and a half a dozen another, or it's you choose to do life your way, we choose to do life ours. I'm not saying you can't have subcultures within Christianity, because that has always been, I think, a thing, and I think it probably always will be a thing. And to some degree, probably some of that is fine. But I do think that there is a cost that needs to be borne when you're creating an imbalance, and that cost, unfortunately, is predominantly borne by the very group of people that we are told to protect. The Christian faith is very clear on this. We are supposed to protect our wives. And so, I then it comes back to the choice of the woman, because some will choose to make themselves more beautiful in terms of, things that they can do on or around their body, and some will choose not to, and that's fine. It's however they want to do it is totally fine, as long as they are feeling free to be themselves and express themselves in a way that is still culturally appropriate. But I just think there is a real cost when you tamp down beauty.
And that cost is handed down multi-generationally. And what was interesting to notice when we were in Florida over the holidays is we saw a wide variety of different people of Amish Mennonite descent. And of course, that's where they gather in Pinecraft for, vacation. And so you had people from all across the distribution, pretty much, and Amish and Mennonite, the whole variety. And it was clear to me that, and this is true of the men and women, but it was clear to me that I'll use the term embodiment, the kind of, solidness of their embodiment. Like, is there a there? Is there a person at home in this meat suit? Is there a sense of a unified sense of self and a divine, person in there that's awake and alert? And, so that's what I mean when I say the term embodied. There was a wide variety of, people who were extremely disembodied and diseased. I'll say, like, not at ease in their body. Very, and you risk that when you have a hyper focus on things like modesty, et cetera, is you risk having this distortion of hyper self-awareness that lends itself to obesity and on purpose unattractive presentation in your embodiment. There's this kind of dulling down of the human experience that's just profoundly sad. And the Amish and Mennonite aren't the only ones doing it. I mean, obviously, you go to Walmart here in Tuscarawas County on a Friday night, it's like you see suffering like mad. I mean, and it's so sad. But there are some Amish Mennonite groups who don't fall prey to that, who have an ability. Like I was, I don't think any of them are going to be listening to this, so I can just say it. But I was visiting some of my dad's cousins in a little community on the outskirts of this community called Danville, Ohio, and they're amongst the what they call the Dan Amish. And they're a more conservative sect than the Old Orders, and they're distinct from the Old Orders in Holmes County, Ohio, because they still have, as a key and core part of their culture, they have tobacco as being like a really central part of their cultural experience. But they're very, very conservative. But when I encountered those people, as opposed to many of the people that I encountered down in Sarasota, is these people were embodied. Like there was a solidness to them. The men probably on average were, 30, 40 pounds lighter. They were more put together. Their frame was more, their posture was better. They were stronger. They were, fewer bellies. The women stood up straight. They carried themselves with a kind of dignity and a beauty to them and an aliveness to them that was just unmistakable when you compared it to some of the other communities that I visited. And I have no idea what causes that. I have some hypotheses around it, but I really don't have any clue. But it's true that there's the subcultures that we grew up in, the Amish Mennonite, that there are some of those derivatives, some of those subcultures that really tamp down the beauty of the individual human expression and are willing to pay that price for the hypothetical unity that comes at the community level, but it causes death and sadness and suffering of the individual in their body, and that doesn't glorify God. That's not, the what God wants. And so I was just noticing the difference where some of them seem to have this real ability to have a unity at the community level, and yet have strong individuals that are embodied and there, and um, look at home in their body. And then others, you just have this, that just look very uncomfortable in their body, and very uncomfortable in their human, just as human beings. They just don't look like they're comfortable with their humanity at all. And oftentimes that manifests itself as having 60, 80, or 100 pounds overweight, but not always. Sometimes it's other things, a kind of hunched over posture, or downcast eyes, whatever the case might be. But you can just notice the way that people, there's something, and this is not a sexual thing at all, but there's something deeply beautiful about a profoundly alive and embodied human being, male or female.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating how certain cultures, subcultures, amplify that or dull it down significantly. I know that's a little deviation from what you started, but
Yeah. Well, I think that when it comes to modesty, that's a word that's very loaded for some people. And I think when it comes to, because of the experiences that they've had to go through in life, because of the particular subculture maybe of Christianity that they were raised in, that's a pretty loaded word. I think that in a lot of cases, not all, because there is something to modesty, and we won't get into the details of that, but that is in the Bible, right? I mean, there is something to that word, but in, I would say, my lived experience, in a lot of cases, in the communities that I see, grew up in, were adjacent to, were familiar with, heard about, most of the cases, most of the talking points, most of the directives, most of the teaching that was centered to the women about modesty was actually an unfortunate and misdirected workaround, instead of making the men strong. In other words, to say it very bluntly, you can get through or get by with weak men, weak boys, if you make the women be modest and reduce the level of beauty, reduce the temptation, reduce interactions, reduce the energy, reduce the vibrancy, reduce the flourishing of life, so that your weak men and your weak boys don't have a problem. And it's fucking wrong. And
I can't say it any better than that.
what needs to, in most cases, the problem is the men. The problem is the boy. The problem is this fucking weak male individual who is not mature, does not have the proper worldview, does not have the proper setting in life, does not have the proper foundation, does not have the proper vision, does not have the proper understanding about how did we get here, where are we going, how is this all supposed to work? I'm confused, I'm a sexual being, I don't know, no one taught me, I don't know how this is supposed to work, and we let that go. And instead of fixing the real problem, we turn our attention to the women and the girls, and we tell them to be more modest, to be more modest, to be more modest, because the men over here and the boys are so fucking weak, they can't handle anything that comes in the close approximation of beauty. And
Yeah.
Look, there is a cost to that. That's why it makes me frustrated. That's why, the temperature goes up a little bit when I talk about this, because we're not going about this the right way.
Exactly.
If you have weak men, you have weak men, and you better work on that problem, because that problem will not get fixed by focusing on the women. Right there is your problem. These and that needs to be fixed. And look, the line between good and evil cuts through the heart of each of us, right? Like, we've all three of us have been those freaking weak men. We've been immature. We've been the guys that didn't have the right foundation. And to some extent, there's still probably little scatters of that in our heart. So this isn't, pointing fingers at others and thinking, well, we're superior. No, we are not. But we should be aware of the problem, and we should fix the real problem, and not focus on the symptoms while we let the actual disease foment in our midst. And so that, to me, that seems like the real problem. And so, if your son or your husband doesn't know how to conduct himself on an average beach in America, that may be fine, and maybe you choose to avoid the beach, and that would be totally fine with me. But if you're going to go out there and you're going to make passive-aggressive comments about how people are dressed on the average American beach and think the problem is with them, you're misguided.
Yeah, 100%. And speaking as someone who has lived this problem and has faced it, almost every aspect of it, like in my own soul, and it doesn't work to just try to tamp it down and control the situation. It doesn't. You have to be transformed. You have to be strengthened. You have to be aligned to love. You have to see with new eyes. And you're exactly right. This tamping down and blaming, the women is well, it doesn't do anybody any good whatsoever.
Well, and can't we see here just a little, and so, I'm sorry, Austin, I'll cut you in a second, but can't we see here in a little bit, based on what we're talking about, how powerful a strong, mature, godly man can be in his family and in the community? Because if you can have this in your household, then your wife can be all that she can be. Your wife can flourish. Your wife can be beautiful in every sense of the word. And now your household is so much better. But now imagine if you can do that in your neighborhood. Like, just imagine if every guy in your neighborhood, every man, was strong and mature and was not lustful and could be trusted and was safe and was generous and was fun-loving and was adventurous and had a vision for his life and his family's life and the community, single or married. Now imagine how that community would flourish. See, I just think so much of it hinges on the men themselves. Austin, you were going to mention something.
Yeah, I guess my issue with the word modesty is that it's only ever pointed at one sex. Just be honest. I mean, it don't, at least every time I hear it, it is. I'm not saying that it's not in the Bible or that there's not a concept here where, and I'm not trying to throw the baby out with bathwater, but why is all legalism and modesty and that kind of thing pointed at women 100% of the time?
Yeah,
exactly.
I don't understand that. And I like what you guys are saying. I mean, I went through a season of time in my life where I realized, like, okay, I actually need to find more beauty in my life that will actually fulfill something in me and actually curb my sexual desires. And I love beauty. I make a ton of money off beauty. You think people are moving the Finger Lakes because they like the weather?
right. Good point.
They love the lakes, man. And they love, I can't tell you how many times people will tell me, clients will be like, yeah, we just started coming here. We love it here. We love the lakes. We love how nice it is. Like, and I know it, like, you sit out there and you look at the water. I mean, it satisfies something in your soul. And, as far as God and beauty goes, like, I mean, do the parrots really need to be all those different colors? And, the sky, do we need that much sky? And flowers, do we need that many variety of flowers? What purpose do they serve? you know, like I think we're so practical so many times we forget that, we're who the inventor of beauty really is. And beauty used to be in the church.
Yeah.
Like, look at the stained glass, go back to cathedrals, go take a trip to Spain. Like, I don't know when it left, but it used to be there. And it was some of the most amazing beauty that there ever was.
I was just
100%.
thinking about that recently, Austin. I'm glad you brought that up. Hey, what do you guys think it means? I guess just besides the obvious, or is that just what it means? The obvious when it says to leave the company of the simple, leave the company of the simple, and live and walk in the way of insight. How does that fall on you? Are we just supposed to, if we have a simple friend, are we supposed to unfriend them or just not associate quite as closely? What does that mean to you guys? Austin, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think iron sharpens iron, and I want to be around people who make me better. Like, if they're not making me better, like, wouldn't that be a version of simple? I mean, somebody who's not really challenging me, somebody who's just going with the flow, somebody who, yeah, I can be acquaintances with them, but I love this whole concept of friendship because I think there's some people that, hey, the relationship expired, just like milk in the fridge. It was there for a time, it expired. That's okay. Like, it expired. Let it expire. Don't force it down your throat and choke on it. Just let the
Yeah.
relationship expire. And so many people cling to what has been because they have no vision for, and they're insecure in who they are. So they want to have all the friends in the world. And I don't need many friends. Like, and I wonder if that's what it's talking about. It's like, if someone's not, I get there's good times and there's not every conversation needs to be as deep as this, but there should be an element of growth and pushing towards wisdom in our relationships.
Is that what it means to you, Patrick, too? Or does anything else come to mind when you read that?
Yeah, the way I think about it is, the people that you're around are going to shape you. And I've been thinking about what shapes me. Ultimately, what you worship is what shapes you. Ultimately, you become like what you behold, and what you behold the most is the thing you worship the most. And so I've become more aware that I just am not willing to be shaped by the subpar, the profane, the lame, the foolish. I only consent to be shaped by that which is highest, that which is holy, that which is sacred, that which is divine. It's the only thing that I want to have shape me truly. And so I just don't want to, yeah, I don't suffer fools that lightly.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about Christian art just briefly. And so this was another thing on the docket, and we won't obviously spend nearly as much time on it. But my question to you guys is, why is it so common that explicitly Christian art is so inferior? And I'm talking of explicitly Christian music and explicitly Christian movies. In my lifetime, both have been pretty bad, and in some cases horrific. And then in some cases, there are some great both movies. Well, I don't know if any movies come to mind. I apologize for that, but music. There is some great Christian music, okay, but by and large, it's pretty bad. Then I thought, well, I said Christian art, but can the same be said of paintings? And I don't know that it can be said of paintings. I'm thinking of The Last Supper and others. Those are explicitly Christian paintings, and they're some of the most well-known paintings of all time. And then Patrick, in the group chat, you actually challenged my entire hypothesis here, which is with the counter that, hey, this is a more recent development. Actually, some of the best music of all time was music that was created for the church. So is this a recent phenomenon that explicitly Christian music and movies, maybe in particular, have been pretty subpar? And why even is that?
I have some thoughts on it. Austin, do you have thoughts on why this is? You're more of a musician than I am, and certainly more of a worship leader and all of that. And I'm curious. I think you write some songs and all of that. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that so many times we try to copy what we're just going to call it worldly music styles, and we try and fit it into the um, Christian music label instead of, I don't even know if I've a complete thought on it, but the music of heaven has to be the best. I just don't think we tap into it. I'm guilty, as much as anyone else. I like good music and like a good song, but I just can't help but think that, like, um, some of these artists out there are just copy and paste, and like, if that makes sense, like more water references and all that stuff. Like, I just like raw, honest music. Like, and I think we don't know how to be that. We don't know how to. I feel like we're still becoming that as Christians as a whole, because people want authenticity. They want the truth. They want the truth, and they want beautiful sound all mixed up in one. And that's a tall order. I mean, you can make nice music that really touches the soul, but then how do you attach a lyric to that hasn't already been said? Um, so I don't know. I don't really have an answer.
Yeah, I do think it's a more recent, it's kind of a modern, postmodern thing, I think, Kent, because clearly some of the old music and some of the old paintings were, some of the best ever made and some of the most, currently the most valuable, and to include sculptures and all of that. So it's not something where Christian art can't be good. It's just that it hasn't been for a couple hundred years. And why is that? And I think part of it is the fact that, this temptation to tamp down beauty, that's part of it. But second, I think, is the temptation towards corrupting the artistic process with propaganda. And, if you look at Soviet art coming out of the 20th century, they maintained their academies for a longer period of time than Western Europe did. So they had highly trained artists painting, but they subordinated those highly skilled artists into the production of communist propaganda, essentially. But and so that reduces the beauty. It dulls the art. When the art is subjugated to propaganda, then you lose the thing that makes it beautiful. And part of what makes art beautiful is the fact that that reality exists on an unfolding kind of revelatory scale. And so the human experience of reality is one of ongoing revelation of an expanding consciousness. And the best art is when someone is tapped into what's happening, and in their perspective, the view of that expansion of consciousness and unfolding nature of reality that they have tapped into. They have a point of view about that, and they're not afraid to share that point of view in their art. That's what makes art good. When Leonardo da Vinci, some of his drawings, some of his artwork, it revealed certain patterns in reality that are just now universally understood to be beautiful. Things like the what do you call the Fibonacci spiral and some of those patterns that are mathematically perfect and that are evident across multiple layers of reality. The Fibonacci spiral shows up, I think, in our retina. It shows up in fish. It shows up in all over the universe. And he picked up on that and he employed that in his art, and it made it just eternally good in some sense. So having a point of view, being connected to reality in a way that allows you to communicate that point of view, that your view of the unfolding nature of reality, is what makes art good. And so I think, to the extent that God is dead, we just live in this world of, total, is just kind of a materialist domain and there's no transcendence. It's like, well, when you lose the transcendence, then, you lose that perspective. And I think the church has, whether or not it realizes it, has fallen prey to some of that thinking. And so it's kind of tamped down the art. But I think maybe the most destructive part of the Christian art scene is the insistence on subjugating the art to the text of the Bible. And where I've learned about this is in listening to Dallas Jenkins' conversation with Jordan Peterson that just came out fairly recently. So Dallas Jenkins is the creator of The Chosen, which is one of the most successful television series in the world of any kind in history. I mean,
Wow.
it's massive. The numbers are unbelievable. And so the way that he described what was different about The Chosen than about most Christian TV and movies is that he wasn't afraid to kind of try to get behind the eyeballs of the people around Jesus and fill in the story with things that were kind of plausible in their cultural context and be able to tell a story according to a traditional 3-act story structure that a movie or a TV show might employ. And he actually made great art, and he told compelling stories in a way that had he wasn't trying to usurp the text. He's a lover of the word, of the Bible, of the text, but he refused to subordinate the storytelling to the strict interpretation of the text. It's like most Christian television and movies go, okay, it's like Jesus did this, and then he did that, and then he did that, and then he did that, and it's just boring and it sucks. It's like you're wasting the best story that's ever been told by refusing to tell us what you think about it. You're just subordinating it all to the compression and the nature of the development of the text in itself is a compression in and of itself. It's like these stories have emerged over time and have been compressed into, stories that we can remember and stories that we can pass along and stories that we can write down. And it's like, they don't contain near the whole of what happened in those contexts, not even close. It's a hyper compression of what actually happened. And so to allow the human spirit to go in there and imagine what it might have been like with fidelity to the and integrity to what the text is trying to say, but to tell a story that's interesting. It's like, well, all of a sudden you've got one of the best TV shows that's ever been written. And it's because he refused to subordinate it to the strict, and it's no different. Like the people who make art, and I think the Kendrick brothers who made, Fireproof and some of these movies that are Christian movies, I think they fall prey to that temptation to kind of propagandize. There's a kind of element of, I'm trying to convince you of something. It's like, when you watch The Chosen, he's not trying to convince you of anything. He's just telling you the story. And it's like this deeply moving story. But whenever there's this element of like, I'm trying to make you think something.
Yeah.
Like that's propaganda and it loses the beauty.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think of a few things. I think money. Let's think about the last 30 to 40 years because that's really kind of our lifetime. So when I think about the last 30 years or so with Christian music, money. My understanding is, and I heard this from a music producer who was involved with both Christian music and hip hop, and then of course hip hop went into Christian. Then there was Christian rap, which is cool because why not? But he actually was saying there was some good money in CCM, contemporary Christian music, and you actually had. This was outside of rap, but you actually had secular artists coming in and all of a sudden sort of becoming Christian or creating Christian music because the money was good in CCM. And so you have money, and money is never the best motivator for the best art. And then so money as a motivator for contemporary Christian music. And I think that music is the best example for that. And then I think as another subset of that, it's sort of related to money. It really is, but just you are going to have a built-in target audience. If you're making a Christian album or a Christian music, you probably already know, or your producer or your agent or whoever, they probably already know like X% of America is Christian, X% is evangelical Christian. And so if you create a movie, which, and I could be wrong, but I would think of this a little bit more in the lines of like Fireproof, like some of these cheesy Christian movies, that is probably sort of what they were doing. They just know like, hey, if you create an explicitly Christian movie, there's some amount of people that are just going to watch it just because they're Christian. You create a Christian movie so that they're going to watch it. So a built-in demographic is what I would say is like point number, 1B maybe, because it's really tied in with money. But then I also think of expectations, and this is a two-edged sword, because this is a good thing for a person to be self-aware, to understand their place in the world, to understand how they're being perceived, to understand their impact on others. And Christians, I would say, are pretty dang good at this. And some of the times it's fantastic, and some of the times it's bad, because maybe some of the times it dips into fear of man. But as an artist, if the expectations of others weighs too heavily on you, or really heavily at all, in my opinion, although I don't know because I'm not really one, I just think that's not going to create the best art.
Absolutely.
So money, built-in demographic, the expectations of others. And I do think you see this in some of the explicitly Christian music and movies in the last 30 years. It kind of seems like, yeah, they're paying pretty close attention on what they're saying and how this lands and how this is going to be received by the demographic. Yeah. But look, and then there's fourth thing that just, I would list it last for a reason, but it just is what it is. And here's what it is substances. I mean, look, you could have Post Malone write and perform, or write and record all of his same songs without drugs and alcohol, and it's not going to be as good. It's just not. I mean,
yeah.
Now, I'm not saying everyone needs to do that. I'm not saying that, because there are some phenomenal. There's a guy in my mind right now. I mean, phenomenal Christian artist in the music space, and his music is actually good, and he performs and he sings and writes songs, and I don't think he's going hard on the substances at all, if he's using them at all. So I'm not saying that's a prerequisite. I'm just saying you're not going to get the Eagles without some of the stuff they were consuming.
Yeah,
I don't think.
That's right.
So then there's that other little fourth thing, which the Christians tend to sort of shy away from, which maybe that's just fine, but it still is.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and just a very brief comment on that last point is that when you consume psychedelics, for example, the doors of your perception are altered. You see new patterns in the world, and that allows you to perhaps get a perception, get a point of view on the unfolding nature of reality that's more interesting and creates more interesting and beautiful art. And so it's not a prerequisite. There's other ways to get that perception too, but it's kind of a fairly reliable way, let's say. And certainly not using any substances limits the view that you have, and sometimes that can be good. And I like I said earlier, I'm kind of in a season of not using substances, and I like that. I'm all about that. But what you said is 100% right.
Yeah, totally. I think it lowers inhibitions, which releases the expectations of others on you, which is interesting because that's just one of the things we talked about. But it all depends what you're optimizing for, because if, say, as an entrepreneur, I think then it's more about productivity and efficiency. And then I think substances can have a negative effect.
100%.
But sometimes with art, I think some of the art we get is actually there in part because of the substances, and I just think that's a hard truth. Hey, last thing, speaking of substances, how do we get through the evenings without using substances? This is the question. I want to get you guys' thoughts on this. I was recently bumped into an old friend. You guys won't both know him. I won't say his name. He is extremely involved at his church, at some of the highest levels in the church without being one of the pastors. He is freaking crushing it at work and just making, I think, boatloads of money from what it seems like. And he recently lost a good amount of weight because he was drinking way less alcohol than he used to. And he has sort of been able to get away from alcohol by utilizing cannabis. And in his case, going from alcohol every night to cannabis most every night helped him lose a lot of weight. He looked healthy. And I don't know that he's necessarily unhappy with that, but it did lead to this question of like, oh, that's interesting because I have a hard time getting through the evening without either alcohol or cannabis myself. And even if it's just, one of my throw a little vodka and some olives in there and kind of one glass and that's it, and you barely really feel anything. But even if that's all it is, for some odd reason, it helps. And, I got on that Zen, so I'm on Zen all the time, but it gets to the point
Yeah.
where that doesn't really necessarily help. It's just sort of,
Different
a
baseline.
baseline.
Yep.
So anyhow, this is the crux of the outcome of that conversation, which is basically him saying, like, how do you not just do something? So this guy is definitely driven. He would say he has an addictive personality, and maybe even a little splash of ADD. And I hope I'm driven. I have an addictive personality sometimes, and I probably have a little splash of the ADD. Morning, no problem. During the day, no problem. Dinner, everything, no problem. And this maybe speaks to the ADD. I have no problem with any of that all day. But when dinner's over, now it's time to relax. Now we're an hour or two or three before bed. It's really, really hard for me just to sit there and read without drinking some alcohol or having some cannabis. And I don't like to do cannabis during the week because for me, it makes it a little harder to get up early the next morning. So if I can sleep in, it's a Saturday morning, or sleep in a little longer or something, Saturday or Sunday, not a problem. But too much kind of back to back, it just gets harder to wake up early. So I don't want to be dealing with that when I want to try to go to the gym. I want every advantage in my favor.
Yep.
So I'm in this weird little system where it's like Sunday through whatever to mid to the end of the week, it's more having a drink or two at night, and then maybe cannabis is more of a weekend thing. And I don't even know if I have a problem with it, to be honest with you guys. Like, I guess I'm just more curious about it, because I don't think I'm asking for help. Like, oh, how do I make this stop? Because I don't know if it needs to stop. I don't even know if it's wrong. But this is how I sort of am finding myself. This is how he finds himself. And I was like, well, let's talk about it actually, because I'm curious if you guys have the same issue and what your thoughts are on it. Austin, I'll kick it to you first, then we'll go Patrick.
So I read that and I added to the notes. I don't know if it's saved or not, but my thing is, it's not cannabis, alcohol, maybe if I let it. Mine's more. I know exactly what you're saying. I can eat healthy. I can live healthy. Have dinner. Put the girls to bed right around 8 p.m. without fail. I just want snacks. I just want all the unhealthy things that I couldn't have from 8 o'clock until 10 o'clock. And that's a problem. I mean, like, it's hard to keep my weight at a healthy balance. So I don't know if this is kind of an underlying issue with. It's more. I mean, when you said it, Ken, I was like, okay, I can relate. Not necessarily with the cannabis thing. Doesn't really do anything for me. Tried it a couple times, but the alcohol, it could be, but it's not really. Every time I have too much alcohol, like, my body's really starting to react negatively to. It feels like substances, period. So then I'm left with, like, food, and I love good food. Like, I love a good, speaking of art, artistic meal that looks good, that tastes good, that pairs nicely with whatever wine or their alcohol they're giving me. I'll take going out to eat any day over any kind of experience, a good dinner somewhere with friends or my wife, whatever. But like for me, it's like I just love all kinds of food. And I have gotten coaching before in the past. In fact, I kind of stopped because one of the questions that she asked was like, because I was trying to get back on this, eating healthy program type of a thing, and excuse me. And one of the questions that the coach asked was, or challenged me on, was like, you need to take like next week and like ask yourself why you have a relationship with food like this. I was like, okay, peace out.
I've
In my
heard
head,
enough. I've heard enough. I'm
in my
done
head,
here.
in my head.
This
But
is
like,
too true.
I'm where you're at. I'm like, well, like, is it wrong? Like, I mean, yes, in excess. Like, I feel like I live a pretty healthy life, but could I lose 10 pounds? Probably, like, kind of a thing. So I'm more curious too to hear maybe Patrick has the answers, because I don't. I read that and I'm like, bro is preaching my story right now, because I'm literally like, I'm doing some fasting this week too, and it's hard, like it sucks. But just to kind of break some of that cycle. And I don't have the answers. I just know that I can relate. It's like all day long, and then right exactly the time you
Yep.
said, like
Right in
I'm
the
right
evening.
there.
Yep. What do you think,
Yeah.
Patrick?
Well, so setting the table for this from my perspective is, for 30 years or so, my drug of choice was pornography. And that using pornography and acting out sexually in some way, like, it's a very predictable, in that it puts you into a certain nervous system state defined by the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, that comes in that. That's you enact that, you initiate that state in a very predictable way. And so when I quit using pornography 7 years ago, I I still had that need to bring that parasympathetic nervous system state and to kind of enter into that rest and digest, instead of so you have sympathetic, which is more of the kind of, facing challenges, fight or flight activation, and then it's the parasympathetic. I think I have that right. It might be switched the other way around, but it's like rest and digest, et cetera. And I think so fundamentally, I think the reason that this struggle is so relatable for all is, I do think that there are structural parts of our life today, like at a really core level, that are that are not well aligned to the human animal in terms of our rhythms that lead to the proper activation of these different nervous system states in a way that aligns with our ability to get rest and to bring ourselves into the desired state that we need to be in to do so. So I think that there are some, and I don't know if it's related to technology. It could be related to, even things that we don't even see, things like Wi-Fi or things like, radio waves or things, it could be just completely outside of our control. But nonetheless, there are patterns and rhythms in modern life that do not bode well for the activation of those necessary nervous system states. One is red light, right? Or blue light, rather. Blue light coming off of our screens is disruptive to the parts of our brain that activate and bring us into a rest and digest kind of nervous system state. And so we seek to bring those states about through external means: alcohol, cannabis, nicotine, pornography, etc. Rich foods, fatty foods, sugary foods, etc. So we have all these tools at our disposal for bringing about the desired nervous system state. And, if you looked at a calendar and charted the last 3 to 5 years of my life, the amount of days that I didn't have either alcohol, tobacco, or cannabis, it would round down to zero, probably. I'm guessing, like, it's pretty like, so last summer I went through a 28-day fast where I only had water for 28 days, no substances. And I'm currently 24, 28 hours fasted now. And I'm starting a 40-day no substance journey right now, and it's not a problem. Like it literally is not an issue for me. I actually don't like it's. I kind of miss the food, but I don't. I'll get to break my fast in the morning, so I'm looking forward to that. I miss the kind of act of smoking. Like in the evening, go out and whether it's cannabis or tobacco, just the kind of getting away from it for 10 minutes and just having a pipe, and like there's something really pleasing about that, and it kind of I'm outdoors, and it kind of brings me into different mental space, headspace. Of all the substances, I love cannabis. I just, to this day, I love cannabis. I love getting high. And so I know that it's, that's something I need to manage. I can't use that at whatever level I'd like to, because I'd just be a pothead and I wouldn't get anything done. And so that's not good for anybody. So, I do see a future in which I'll be able to use cannabis occasionally. I'm sitting around a campfire with the guys or whatever, and somebody's passing the bowl around. I think there's great times to smoke cannabis. I'm a fan. But if I'm using anything on a routine basis, I tend to think that it would be better for me to step back and look at the patterns of my life and try to determine with wisdom what are the patterns that would lead me into a greater connection with reality. The verse that comes to mind here is that Jesus said in John 8:31 and 32 that if we follow his teachings, we become his disciples, that we will encounter reality in a way that liberates us. The language is that we will know the truth and the truth will set us free. But the ancient language underneath that is that we will encounter ultimate reality in a way that liberates us. And that's my defining quest in life, is to encounter what is most real for the purpose of glory, for the purpose of liberation, for the purpose of being more fully alive. And to my understanding of that is that my apprenticeship at the feet of Yeshua is what, like, the more that I'm apprenticed to Yeshua, the more that I am put in touch with the ultimate patterns of reality in a way that are liberating. And I mean that at every level, liberating mentally, liberating my nervous system, liberating my immune response, liberating my health at every level, liberating my mind, body, soul, spirit, all of it, liberating, like true liberation, true kingdom of heaven manifestation, alignment. It's an elevation of my consciousness to a Christ consciousness, a greater union, experiencing the ecstasy of union with the divine, and that is my that desire sits at the top of my kind of attentional hierarchy, my pursuit in life at this point. And so I'm willing to sacrifice all of that, and it is uncomfortable. There's definitely the religious trauma of growing up in the context that I did and all of that, like it messed up my nervous system in a way that has caused me decades of pain, in like a lot of pain. I've lived with constant pain at some level for, many years. And I'm on a path where that's lessening. And for a long time, I used cannabis to mediate that pain, but I'm now learning what patterns I can live into to mediate that pain outside of the use of substances. And I see that as part of my apprenticeship to Yeshua. Now, I don't think that there's anything wrong per se with using substances, but there is one of the truths of reality that I've encountered is that you have to feel it to heal it. And having the courage and being willing to face the discomfort and feeling it and allowing myself to cry out and reach out to God in the depths of those, going up to the edge of the abyss of the pain, the inner, being wrapped around the axle of reality, and allowing that to slowly unwind and feel the discomfort and the pain of that, and fully feel it. I suspect that my over-reliance on substances probably slowed down my healing in an ultimate sense because I didn't feel it and didn't heal it. I'm now entering a period of my life where I'm very much feeling it and healing it. And so that's where I find myself, is looking for the patterns that lead to greater health, and that, to me, that is wisdom. That's wisdom beckoning to me. And I have a vision in my head of what, a true Garden of Eden type of life would look like if I was living in true union with the divine. And to walk unself-consciously in the cool of the day with God, and to allow that to shape me and mold me. And so I don't want to slow that process down. I don't want to dull myself to that process. I don't want to, even though I love alcohol, I love cannabis, I love smoking a cigarette. I freaking smoking a cigarette is one of the best 5-7 minutes of it's awesome. Like, it truly is. Like, if you haven't tried it, I'm not saying you should, but it's great. Like, just sparking up an American spirit. It's like with coffee in your hand. Like, it's awesome. Like, it's a thing of beauty. And I will always, I think, unless God changes my mind about this, I will always, have a space in my life to enjoy that with certain people at certain times and in the right way. But I do not want to use any of that to slow down the process of connecting most deeply with what is ultimately real in a way that's liberating and healing.
Yeah. Well said. Well, that's a good place to end it. Let's just come to a screeching halt. Thank you for those thoughts, Patrick. That was great. The only thing that I've been able to semi-successfully do is like, okay, well, if I'm up later, then I'm smoking more or I'm drinking more. So let's cut out some of that time. And
going to bed early helps.
Yeah. And if you get up
really
earlier,
does.
then you got to go to bed earlier. And then that window that might have been, 3, 4, 5 hours is now 2-3 hours. And so, it's super practical, but it has helped.
Wisdom.
Yeah,
Yep.
Wisdom. All right, Metal and Forge on YouTube, Mettle. You know how to spell it already. Metal and Forge on YouTube and Spotify, and that's it. Miller, what do you want to plug?
I am preparing to launch the first episode of the Good King podcast. It should be out tomorrow, so check that out on YouTube. Well, actually, tomorrow it'll be out before this episode airs. So check out Good King.
What's the format, Patrick? Just you, or you and guests,
initially,
or what?
Initially, just the first episode in the bag is just me on camera introducing and setting up the context of the podcast, but I am going to have some guests. And the whole idea is to seek to find the way to live the pattern, the ethos of the Good King in our life as leaders, as men, being shaped by the King of Kings. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And we talk about responsibility. We talk about the rhythms of life that lead to flourishing. There's all kinds of stuff. So
amazing.
Yeah, check it out.
We'll do. Austin, what do you want to plug?
Facebook. I'm on Facebook. I mean, I'm not this week that much.
Yep.
Trying to do less social media too. So, yep.
Less is more. All right. Good night, boys. Bye, everybody.
Good night.
All right.
Love you guys.
Love you guys too.